I only remember the moment everything started feeling wrong, not what actually caused it. My name is Olivia Carter, and that is the only way I can describe my wedding night now, as if the beginning and the end of that memory have been separated by something I cannot fully reconstruct anymore. It was supposed to be the most important day of my life in Chicago, Illinois, with warm lights reflecting off white decorations, soft music playing in the background, and guests gathered from both sides of the family. My brother, Ethan Carter, was there too, standing closer than usual, smiling in a way that felt familiar but slightly different from how he normally looked at me. At the time, I did not question it, because weddings are chaotic, emotional, and full of movement, and everyone behaves a little differently under pressure. I remember holding a drink in my hand while talking to relatives, laughing at something someone said, and turning away for only a few seconds when Ethan approached me. That moment is where everything becomes unclear in my memory, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet disruption, like a page in a book that has been slightly altered without obvious signs. I do not remember noticing anything unusual in the drink itself, and I do not remember feeling alarm or suspicion at that exact moment, only a subtle shift in how I was experiencing the environment afterward, as if the rhythm of the night no longer matched the rhythm of my thoughts. People were still talking, music was still playing, and the wedding continued as expected, but my perception of time began to feel inconsistent, like certain parts were missing or slightly displaced. Ethan stayed nearby for most of the evening, but I cannot clearly recall every interaction, only fragments of expressions, brief moments of eye contact, and conversations that feel incomplete when I try to reconstruct them later. My parents, Robert Carter and Melissa Carter, appeared normal on the surface, engaged with guests and maintaining the atmosphere expected of a celebration, yet I now find myself questioning small details in how they responded to me that night, as if their behavior contained signals I did not recognize at the time. The strange part is that no one else seemed to react to anything unusual during the wedding, which makes me wonder whether the issue was visible at all, or whether it existed only in my own experience of that moment. I remember sitting down for a while, feeling slightly disconnected from the flow of conversation around me, observing instead of participating, without fully understanding why I had shifted into that state. It was not fear in the way people usually describe it, but something quieter, more internal, like a delay between what was happening and how I was processing it. Later, when I tried to recall the sequence of events, I realized that there were gaps that did not match the continuity of a normal memory, and those gaps always seemed to center around moments when Ethan was closest to me. I do not want to make assumptions about what happened that night, because assumptions create stories without evidence, and I am still trying to separate memory from interpretation. What I do know is that the wedding ended like any other wedding, with music fading, guests leaving, and conversations dissolving into the night. But I left that event with a sense that something within the structure of that evening no longer aligned with how I remember experiencing it. And the more I think about it now, the more I realize that the real question is not what happened in front of everyone, but what changed in the parts of that night that no one else seems to question but me. The next few days after the wedding did not bring clarity, only a gradual awareness that something about my experience that night was not aligning with how everyone else seemed to remember it. My name is Olivia Carter, and I found myself repeatedly returning to small fragments of that evening, trying to reconstruct a continuous sequence that still felt incomplete no matter how many times I replayed it in my mind. I would wake up in the morning with a sense of uncertainty that I could not immediately place, as if my memory of the wedding was intact in pieces but not in structure, like a photograph that had been cut and reassembled incorrectly. At first, I told myself that this was normal, that weddings are overwhelming events and that emotional intensity often distorts recollection. But the more I tried to accept that explanation, the more I noticed specific inconsistencies that I could not easily dismiss. One of the most persistent details was my brother Ethan Carter's behavior during the event, particularly the moments when he was physically close to me. He could remember his presence clearly, but not the continuity of our interactions, only isolated fragments that did not fully connect into a coherent timeline. When I mentioned small parts of that evening to my parents, Robert Carter and Melissa Carter, their responses were neutral but noticeably brief, as if there was an unspoken understanding not to extend the conversation beyond surface-level acknowledgement. They would confirm general details of the wedding, such as how many guests attended or how smoothly the ceremony proceeded, but whenever I attempted to focus on specific personal moments, the conversation would subtly shift away. This pattern was not direct avoidance, but something more controlled and consistent, like a shared decision to limit how deeply the topic should be explored. Over time, I began to notice that even when I spoke to other relatives, the responses followed a similar pattern, where people would engage briefly but avoid confirming or denying any detail that required closer examination. It was not that anyone was openly refusing to talk, but rather that the conversation naturally seemed to settle at a certain level of generality that could not easily be pushed deeper. As I continued to reflect on the wedding, I started writing down what I could remember, not because I expected answers, but because I wanted to preserve the fragments before they became even more difficult to trust. What surprised me most was how certain sections of that night were vivid and detailed, while others felt completely absent, not blurred or faded, but missing in a way that created structural gaps in the timeline. The more I tried to reconstruct those gaps, the more I became aware that they consistently surrounded moments involving Ethan, although I could not determine whether that pattern had significance or whether I was simply connecting unrelated fragments. He also began to notice that when I asked indirect questions about the wedding in casual conversation, people would sometimes pause slightly longer than expected before responding, as if considering not only the answer but also the level of detail appropriate to share. These pauses were subtle, but over time they accumulated into a pattern that made me feel increasingly uncertain about what was being collectively acknowledged versus what was being left unspoken. He did not want to jump to conclusions, because conclusions require certainty, and what I had at this stage was still uncertainty and fragmented recollection. But I could not ignore the growing awareness that my experience of that night and the way others described it were not entirely aligned, and that difference, however small it seemed at first, was beginning to shape how I understood everything that happened afterward. And as I continued trying to reconstruct the evening in my mind, I realized that the real challenge was not just remembering what occurred, but understanding why certain parts of that memory seemed to resist being fully completed. As I continued trying to reconstruct the wedding night in my mind, I began to realize that the issue was no longer just about missing memories, but about the way those missing sections were affecting my ability to trust the sequence of events as a whole. My name is Olivia Carter, and at this point, I found myself dividing my recollection into two categories, what I could clearly remember and what felt structurally incomplete, as if the timeline itself had been interrupted in specific places that I could not easily explain. The most unsettling part was that the gaps in my memory were not random. They seemed to cluster around specific moments involving my brother Ethan Carter, although I still could not determine whether this was meaningful or simply a result of selective recall under stress. When I attempted to discuss this with my parents, Robert Carter and Melissa Carter, I noticed a consistent pattern in how the conversation unfolded. They would listen without interruption, but their responses were always carefully limited, often redirecting the focus toward general impressions of the wedding rather than the specific moments I was trying to clarify. It was not that they denied anything outright, but rather that the conversation seemed to naturally avoid the exact points I needed to explore further. Over time, I started paying closer attention to these responses, not just for what was said, but for what was consistently left unaddressed. There was a noticeable difference between how people described the wedding as a complete event and how I experienced it in fragments, and that difference became harder to ignore the more I tried to reconstruct it. He also began to realize that whenever I mentioned Ethan directly in relation to that evening, the tone of the conversation would subtly shift, not in an obvious or confrontational way, but in a manner that suggested a shared understanding not to expand too far in that direction. These shifts were small, almost imperceptible at first, but they accumulated into a pattern that made me question whether certain details were being collectively softened or intentionally left vague. At this stage, I was not accusing anyone of anything, because I still did not have enough clarity to form conclusions, But I could not ignore the growing sense that my perspective of the event was not fully aligned with the version that existed within my family's collective memory. The more I reflected on this, the more I began to consider the possibility that my memory itself might not be incomplete by accident, but incomplete by design, not necessarily through deliberate action, but through the way certain experiences are remembered differently depending on who is recalling them. I found myself revisiting the same fragments repeatedly, trying to place them in order, but each attempt only emphasized how disconnected certain sections felt from the rest of the timeline. It was as if I was trying to reconstruct a continuous line from pieces that were never meant to be connected in the first place. Even so, I resisted drawing conclusions too quickly, because I understood that memory is not always reliable under emotional or social pressure, and I did not want to misinterpret gaps as evidence of something that might not exist. Still, the persistence of those gaps, especially around Ethan's proximity during the evening, continued to stand out in a way I could not easily dismiss. And as I continued to sit with that uncertainty, I began to understand that the real difficulty was not simply in remembering what had happened, but in determining whether what I could not remember was something I had simply forgotten, or something that had never fully reached my awareness in the first place. As I moved further into trying to make sense of the wedding night, I began to realize that my struggle was no longer just about recovering missing pieces of memory, but about understanding why those missing pieces were beginning to feel increasingly significant in a way I could not easily dismiss. My name is Olivia Carter, and by this point, I had developed a habit of mentally separating what I could confidently recall from what felt uncertain, almost as if I were building two parallel versions of the same event and trying to determine which one aligned more closely with reality. In one version, the wedding remained a continuous sequence of normal interactions, conversations, and familiar family dynamics. In the other version, there were interruptions in continuity that I could not fully explain, particularly in relation to my brother Ethan Carter, whose presence during certain moments felt clear but whose interactions with me remained fragmented in a way that did not resolve no matter how many times I tried to reconstruct them. When I spoke again with my parents, Robert Carter and Melissa Carter, I noticed that their responses continued to follow the same pattern I had observed earlier, where general aspects of the wedding were discussed openly, but any attempt to focus on specific moments would lead to subtle redirection. It was not avoidance in an obvious sense, but rather a consistent limitation in how far the conversation would naturally extend when it approached certain details. Over time, I began to pay more attention to these conversational boundaries, because they seemed to appear without being explicitly acknowledged, as if everyone involved understood where the discussion should stop without needing to agree on it verbally. These created a growing sense of imbalance between my internal uncertainty and the external consistency presented by others, which made me question whether the issue was in my memory or in the way information was being shared after the event. He also started noticing that when Ethan was mentioned indirectly in casual conversation, there would often be a brief pause before the topic shifted, not in a way that suggested discomfort, but in a way that suggested careful consideration of what should and should not be expanded upon. These pauses were subtle, but the repetition across different conversations made them more noticeable over time, especially when combined with the consistent lack of detail surrounding certain parts of the wedding night. I found myself returning again and again to the same fragments of memory, attempting to place them into a coherent sequence, but each attempt only highlighted how certain sections remained disconnected from the rest of the timeline. It was as if I were trying to complete a structure that had missing segments that could not be filled through repetition alone. At this stage, I still avoided drawing conclusions, because I understood that uncertainty does not automatically imply meaning, and I did not want to project interpretation onto gaps that might simply be the result of stress or emotional overload. However, the persistence of these gaps, particularly around moments involving Ethan, continued to create a sense of structural imbalance in how I understood the event. The more I reflected on this, the more I began to consider that memory itself might not always function as a complete recording, but rather as a selective reconstruction influenced by perspective, attention, and context. This possibility did not provide clarity, but it did shift my focus away from trying to force a single explanation and toward examining the pattern of what consistently remained unclear. He also began to realize that the difficulty was not only in identifying what I could not remember, but in understanding why certain parts of the memory resisted being connected to the rest of the narrative in a stable way. And as I continued to sit with that uncertainty, I became increasingly aware that the true issue might not be whether something had been forgotten, but whether the structure of the memory itself was ever fully accessible in a single, continuous form to begin with. As I continued moving deeper into the days following the wedding, I began to understand that the uncertainty I was experiencing was no longer limited to fragmented memories of a single evening, but had started to influence the way I interpreted every attempt at recollection, as if each time I tried to reconstruct the event, I was also reconstructing my own perception of what was considered normal within that environment. My name is Olivia Carter, and at this stage, I found myself increasingly aware that the wedding night was no longer just a memory I was trying to recover, but a structure of experience that resisted being assembled into a single continuous narrative. Each time I attempted to revisit the sequence of events, I noticed that certain sections remained consistently unstable, particularly those involving my brother Ethan Carter, whose presence during the evening felt both familiar and difficult to fully place within a linear timeline. When I spoke with my parents, Robert Carter and Melissa Carter, I began to notice that their responses had developed a kind of consistency that was no longer just conversational limitation, but a repeated pattern of narrowing detail whenever the discussion approached specific moments I was trying to clarify. They did not refuse to answer, nor did they directly contradict anything I said, but instead guided the conversation toward broader descriptions of the wedding, as if the exact details I was focusing on were not part of the version of the event that was being collectively reinforced. Over time, I started to recognize that this pattern was not isolated to my immediate family, but appeared in slightly different forms whenever I attempted to discuss the wedding with others who had been present. The responses were always general, always slightly distant from the specific points I was trying to reconstruct, and always structured in a way that prevented the conversation from settling too deeply on any one moment. This consistency made it increasingly difficult to dismiss the possibility that what I was experiencing was not simply confusion in memory, but a difference in how the same event was being framed depending on perspective and context. He also began to notice that my attempts to write down the sequence of events introduced another layer of difficulty, because the more I documented what I could remember, the more obvious it became that certain transitions between moments were missing entirely, creating gaps that could not be filled through repetition or reasoning alone. These gaps were not random, and they did not appear evenly distributed throughout the memory, but instead seemed to cluster around particular interactions that involved Ethan, which made me increasingly aware of how uneven the structure of my recollection had become. Despite this, I remained cautious about drawing conclusions, because I understood that memory is not a fixed recording, but a process influenced by attention, emotional state, and external context, and I did not want to misinterpret uncertainty as evidence of something more definitive. However, the persistence of these structural inconsistencies made it difficult to ignore the sense that my experience of the wedding night was not fully aligned with the way it was being described by others, even in general terms. As I reflected further, I began to realize that what I was dealing with might not be a simple case of missing memory, but a difference in narrative structure, where certain details were either emphasized, minimized, or left unspoken depending on who was recounting them. This did not provide clarity, but it did shift my focus away from trying to force a single coherent version of events, and toward understanding why certain parts of the memory consistently resisted integration into a unified timeline. And as I continued to sit with that uncertainty, I became more aware that the real question was no longer just what I could or could not remember, but whether the event itself was ever fully shared in the same way between everyone who was present, or whether each person had experienced only a partial version of something that could never be fully reconstructed from a single perspective. As I continued to move further into the process of trying to understand the wedding night in a more complete way, I began to realize that my difficulty was no longer centered only on memory itself, but on the growing realization that every attempt to reconstruct that evening was also shaped by the way information about it was being presented, limited, or softened in conversation afterward. My name is Olivia Carter, and at this stage, I found myself increasingly aware that the wedding was no longer just a past event I was trying to remember, but a shared reference point that existed differently depending on who was describing it, as if the same night had been experienced through multiple versions that did not fully align with one another. When I spoke with my parents, Robert Carter and Melissa Carter, I noticed that their responses had become even more consistent in structure than before, always remaining calm, measured, and general in tone, but never fully engaging with the specific moments I was trying to clarify. It was not that they avoided me directly, but rather that the conversation itself seemed to naturally resist entering any detailed examination of the parts of the night that I found most unclear. Overtime, I began to notice that this was not limited to my immediate family, but appeared in different forms whenever I attempted to bring up the wedding with anyone who had attended, as if there was an unspoken boundary around how deeply the event could be discussed in detail. The more I observed this pattern, the more I started to question whether the inconsistencies I was experiencing were truly coming from gaps in my memory, or from the way those memories were being shaped after the fact through repeated retellings that focused only on certain parts of the evening while leaving others unaddressed. He also began to notice that whenever I attempted to describe specific sequences of events in writing, the same structural gaps would appear. Particularly around moments involving my brother Ethan Carter, although I still could not determine whether this indicated significance or was simply a result of fragmented recall. What made this increasingly difficult to dismiss was the consistency of how these gaps appeared, always in similar positions within the timeline, always interrupting transitions between moments rather than isolated details. These created a sense that the memory was not simply incomplete, but unevenly structured in a way that resisted full reconstruction through repetition alone. As I continued to reflect on this, I became more aware that my attempts to understand the wedding were no longer just about recovering missing information, but about trying to reconcile two different ways in which the same event seemed to exist, one that I could partially reconstruct internally, and another that was being maintained externally through collective description. These did not provide me with a clear explanation, but it did shift my focus toward the possibility that the difference between these versions was not necessarily caused by deception or intention, but by the way memory itself can diverge when it is shaped through multiple perspectives that emphasize different parts of the same experience. Even with this understanding, I still found myself returning to the same unresolved gaps, because they continued to resist integration into a single continuous sequence no matter how many times I revisited them. And as I sat with that realization, I began to understand that the central difficulty was no longer just about what I could or could not remember, but about whether the full structure of that night was ever fully accessible from any single point of view in the first place, or whether what I was trying to reconstruct was always only ever a partial reflection of a shared experience that could never be completely unified into one consistent narrative. As I continued moving deeper into my attempt to understand the full structure of the wedding night, I began to realize that the issue was no longer simply about missing memory or incomplete recall, but about the increasingly complex relationship between what I personally remembered and what appeared to be the collectively accepted version of the same event. My name is Olivia Carter, and at this stage, I found myself constantly navigating between two parallel interpretations of that night, one formed from fragmented personal recollection and another shaped by repeated external references that consistently avoided detailed alignment with my own gaps in memory. When I spoke with my parents, Robert Carter and Melissa Carter, I noticed that their responses had become not only consistent in tone, but also increasingly uniform in structure, as if every attempt to discuss the wedding had been unconsciously guided toward a predefined level of generality that prevented deeper exploration. It was not that they denied my questions or contradicted my statements, but rather that their answers seemed to exist within a narrow boundary where specificity was naturally reduced, especially whenever the conversation approached moments that I could not fully reconstruct on my own. Over time, this pattern became more noticeable, because it was not isolated to my immediate family but appeared in similar ways across different conversations with people who had attended the wedding, suggesting a shared tendency to frame the event in broad terms rather than engage with its more specific sequences. As I continued to reflect on this, I started to recognize that the gaps in my memory were not only recurring, but also positioned in a way that consistently disrupted transitions between key moments, particularly those involving my brother Ethan Carter, although I still could not determine whether this pattern carried meaning or was simply the result of fragmented recall under emotional stress. What made this increasingly difficult to ignore was the stability of those gaps across repeated attempts at reconstruction, as if certain sections of the timeline resisted being integrated into a continuous narrative regardless of how many times I revisited them. He also began to notice that when I attempted to document the sequence of events in writing, the same structural inconsistencies appeared, reinforcing the sense that the issue was not limited to verbal memory but extended to any attempt at formal reconstruction of the night. At this point, I found myself increasingly aware that my experience of the wedding was divided between what I could remember with clarity and what remained structurally incomplete, and that this division was not random but consistently organized around similar points in the timeline. As I reflected further on these patterns, I began to consider the possibility that the difference between my internal recollection and the external descriptions I encountered might not be a contradiction in the traditional sense, but rather a divergence in how the same event was selectively emphasized and transmitted across different perspectives. This did not provide a definitive explanation, but it did shift my attention away from trying to force a single unified version of events and toward understanding why certain parts of the experience consistently resisted being fully integrated into that structure. Even with this shift in perspective, I still found myself returning repeatedly to the same unresolved sections, because they continued to create a sense of discontinuity that could not be resolved through repetition or reasoning alone. And as I continued to sit with that uncertainty, I began to realize that the central issue might not be about reconstructing a missing memory, but about understanding whether the wedding night was ever fully experienced as a single continuous narrative by anyone involved, or whether what I was attempting to reconstruct had always existed only as a collection of partial perspectives that could never be fully unified into one complete and consistent account. As I continued reflecting on everything surrounding the wedding night, I began to understand that I was no longer simply trying to recover a missing sequence of personal memory, but was instead confronting the possibility that the structure of that memory itself might not exist in a single stable form that could be reconstructed from any one perspective. My name is Olivia Carter, and at this stage, I found myself increasingly aware that what I had originally treated as a personal gap in recollection was actually part of a larger pattern of fragmentation that extended beyond my own perception and into the way the entire event was being represented through different accounts. When I spoke with my parents, Robert Carter and Melissa Carter, I noticed that their responses had become even more carefully contained, maintaining a consistent tone of neutrality that avoided engaging with the specific details I was attempting to clarify, particularly those moments that did not align clearly with the broader version of events they seemed comfortable discussing. It was not that they contradicted me or refused to answer, but rather that their explanations remained within a controlled range of general description, as if there was an unspoken limit to how precise the conversation was allowed to become when addressing the wedding night. Over time, I began to recognize that this limitation was not unique to my immediate family, but appeared in different forms across other conversations as well, where people who had been present at the wedding consistently described it in broad, continuous terms that did not fully correspond with the fragmented structure of my own recollection. This growing difference between my internal experience and the external narrative being shared with me made it increasingly difficult to determine whether I was dealing with incomplete memory or with selectively emphasized recollection that naturally filters out certain details in collective retelling. As I continued to examine my own written attempts to reconstruct the sequence of events, I found that the same structural gaps persisted, particularly around moments involving my brother Ethan Carter, although I still could not determine whether this pattern indicated significance or was simply the result of fragmented attention under emotional and social pressure. What made this increasingly difficult to dismiss was the consistency with which these gaps appeared, always interrupting transitions between key moments rather than isolated details, creating a pattern of discontinuity that remained stable no matter how many times I revisited it. He also began to notice that when I attempted to compare my written reconstruction with verbal accounts from others, there was never a direct contradiction, but instead a persistent mismatch in level of detail, where their descriptions remained complete at a general level while mine remained incomplete at a structural level. This created a sense that the issue was not simply about accuracy of memory, but about how different perspectives naturally construct different levels of narrative continuity from the same shared event. At this point, I became increasingly cautious about forming conclusions, because I understood that memory is not a fixed recording but a reconstructive process influenced by context, attention, and repetition, and I did not want to interpret structural gaps as evidence of something definitive without sufficient grounding. However, the repetition of the same patterns across multiple sources of recollection made it difficult to ignore the possibility that what I was experiencing was not an isolated issue of recall, but a consistent divergence in how the wedding night existed within different narrative frameworks. As I continued to sit with this uncertainty, I began to realize that the central question was no longer about filling in missing pieces of a single memory, but about whether the wedding itself could ever be fully unified into one continuous narrative from any perspective, or whether it only existed as overlapping partial versions that could never be fully reconciled into a single complete account. As I reached the final stage of trying to understand the wedding night, I began to realize that what I had been searching for was no longer just missing memory or incomplete recall, but a stable explanation for why my experience of that evening continued to resist alignment with the way it was consistently described by everyone else. My name is Olivia Carter, and by this point, I found myself no longer focused on recovering every missing detail, but instead on understanding the structure of how that night existed within different accounts, including my own, which no longer felt like a single continuous narrative but rather a sequence of fragments that refused to fully connect. When I spoke with my parents, Robert Carter and Melissa Carter, I noticed that their responses had not changed in content, but had become even more refined in their consistency, always returning to a stable, generalized version of the wedding that avoided engaging with the specific transitions I could not reconstruct. It was not that they were withholding information in an obvious or direct way, but rather that the boundaries of what was naturally discussed seemed firmly established, as if the conversation itself had settled into a predefined shape that could not easily expand into more detailed examination of the evening. Over time, I began to recognize that this pattern was not limited to my immediate family, but extended across nearly every interaction I had with others who were present at the wedding, where descriptions remained coherent at a broad level but consistently avoided the specific structural gaps that dominated my own recollection. These created an increasingly noticeable divergence between how the event existed in collective description and how it existed within my own memory, which now felt less like a single narrative with missing pieces and more like a collection of segments that could not be successfully merged into a unified timeline. As I continued to analyze my written notes and internal reconstruction attempts, I observed that the same discontinuities remained fixed in place, always appearing around similar transitions, particularly those involving my brother Ethan Carter, although I still could not determine whether this repetition indicated meaning or was simply the result of cognitive fragmentation under emotional stress. What made this situation increasingly difficult to resolve was that no single account contradicted another in an explicit way, yet none of them aligned fully at the level of detail I was attempting to reconstruct, creating a state where all versions coexisted without ever fully intersecting. He also began to realize that my attempts to force a linear sequence onto the memory were not resolving the issue, but instead highlighting the degree to which certain parts of the experience resisted integration into a continuous structure, regardless of how many times I revisited them. At this stage, I became more cautious about interpreting these inconsistencies, because I understood that memory is inherently reconstructive and influenced by many factors, including perspective, emotional focus, and subsequent retelling, and I did not want to assign meaning to structural gaps without sufficient justification. However, the persistence and consistency of those gaps across different methods of recall made it increasingly difficult to dismiss the possibility that what I was dealing with was not simply incomplete memory, but a fundamental difference in how the same event could exist simultaneously as multiple partial narratives. As I continued to sit with this realization, I began to understand that the central issue was no longer about recovering a missing sequence, but about confronting the possibility that the wedding night was never fully contained within a single continuous experience, and that what I had been trying to reconstruct all along was not a complete memory waiting to be recovered, but a fragmented convergence of perspectives that could never be fully unified into one definitive account.